The wind in the high country of Wyoming doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives, and when it does, everything else stopped mattering. Gideon Rourke felt it before he saw it. He was standing on the porch of his cabin, one hand braced against the rough-hewn post, his eyes fixed on the western ridge, where the sky had gone the color of an old bruise. Not gray, not white. That particular shade of iron and violet that meant the season had made up its mind. He was 42 years old, though he looked a decade older in certain lights and a decade younger when he moved. He was lean in the way that working men are lean, not sculpted, but worn the way a good tool gets worn when it's used for the thing it was built for. His hair was dark brown, cut close on the sides, a little longer on top, threaded through with early silver. His face was weathered in a way that suggested not age but exposure, sun and altitude and wind, and years of watching horizons for things that might kill him. He had a beard kept short and neat, the kind of man grows not for style but because shaving every day stopped making sense at some point, and he never bothered to reconsider. His eyes were gray, not pale gray, dark gray, the color of granite after rain. They were quiet eyes in the way that deep water is quiet calm at the surface, something heavier moving underneath. He wore a canvas work jacket over a heavy flannel shirt, denim worn white at the knees, and boots that had walked enough ground to earn their scars. He was a man who had stripped his life down to what was functional and left the rest behind. He had done it intentionally. He had done it carefully. He was not hiding. He was preserving. At his left knee, sitting exactly as still as he was, sat Scout. Scout was a German shepherd, 2.5 years old, though the silver and gray in his coat made him look older, ancient, even like something that had walked out of a folk tale rather than a rescue shelter. He didn't have the classic black and tan that most people pictured when they thought of his breed. He was all winter colors, pale silver along his back, deep charcoal at his ears, and muzzle lighter gray along his chest and legs. In the snow, he nearly disappeared. In the forest, he looked like something the forest had made itself. Scout didn't wag his tail at the approaching storm. He didn't growl. He just watched the ridge the same way Gideon did, with the settled attention of a creature that had learned to take the world seriously. They had been together for 2.5 years. Gideon had driven 4 hours to a shelter outside Cheyenne to get him 3 months after Nora died. He hadn't planned on getting a dog. He had planned on coming home, sitting down, and existing in the silence until the silence got easier. But the silence had gotten heavier instead, and one morning in February, he had gotten in the truck and driven south without fully deciding to. He came back with Scout. They didn't bond the way people describe bonding with dogs, with games and affection and gradual trust. They had simply recognized something in each other on the first day and reached an agreement. Scout would not perform happiness he didn't feel. Gideon would not ask him to. In exchange, they would watch out for each other. They had kept their end of the bargain ever since. Nora had been gone 3 years now. 3 years, 1 month, and some days Gideon stopped counting, and some days he couldn't stop. She had been a geologist, practical and brilliant and funny, in a dry way that crept up on you. She had loved this land with the specific love of someone who understood what it was made of, literally the layers of sediment and pressure and time that had built these mountains. She had wanted the cabin. She had designed it herself, sketched it on a legal pad over a weekend, argued with the contractor about the angle of the roof and the placement of the windows. She had wanted to see the western ridge from the kitchen, so the kitchen faced west. Gideon still stood at that window every morning when he made coffee. The satellite phone rang. He let it ring twice. He always let it ring twice. A habit from a different life, a way of collecting himself before picking up. He went inside the cabin door, swinging shut behind him with a solid thud, and lifted the receiver. Gideon. Ruth Halsey's voice came through with a faint crackle of static. She was 63 and had lived 12 miles down the mountain since before he arrived, and she left pies on his porch sometimes and otherwise respected the distance he kept. She was the only person in his contact list who called without sending a message first. Ruth. Something wrong, the storm, she said. Her voice had a particular quality, warm but direct, the voice of a woman who had spent her life saying what needed to be said without decoration. I've got renters in the Aspen cabin. Young woman came up 2 days ago. I haven't been able to reach her since yesterday morning. I'm stuck down in town, can't get up the road. Gideon. I've got a bad feeling. He looked through the window. The first flakes had begun slow and fat, the polite opening act before the main event. How far out is the storm? 6 hours. Maybe less. He already knew the answer he was going to give. He knew at the moment she said bad feeling because Ruth Halsey was not a woman who said those words for nothing. I'll go check. Bless you. The key's under the east side porch board if she's not there. Just make sure the door's latched and the emergency kit under the sink is stocked. He hung up, looked at Scout and said, load up. Scout's ears rose. A change in routine. He stood and moved to the door without ceremony waiting. That was the thing about Scout. He didn't celebrate departures or arrivals. He simply prepared. The logging road to the Aspen cabin was already treacherous. Gideon drove the old pickup at a crawl, his headlights cutting pale cones through the early dark of the storm. The wipers worked steadily. Scout sat rigid in the passenger seat, his nose lifted, reading the air that came through the heating vents in layers Gideon couldn't access. No car in the drive when they pulled up. The cabin dark. She's not here, Gideon said, more to himself than the dog. The relief in his voice was honest. He didn't want to be involved in someone else's emergency. He never did anymore. He put the truck in park and stepped out. The snow was already an inch deep, covering the gravel clean. He was halfway to the porch when the world behind him came apart. Scout hit the passenger window so hard the whole door rattled. Not once, repeatedly frantic, his barks cutting through the sound of the wind with a pitch Gideon had never heard from him before. In 2.5 years, Scout had never done this. He didn't bark at strangers. He didn't bark at animals. He watched and he waited and he made decisions quietly. This was not a decision. This was an alarm. Gideon stopped walking. He turned. Scout was throwing himself against the glass claws, scrambling his whole body, a single urgent argument. Gideon went back and opened the door. Scout launched out and ran, not to the tree line, not to the perimeter, straight to the cabin's front door. He reared up on his hind legs and hit the wood with both paws, barking with a ferocity that shortened Gideon's breath. There was something on the other side of that door. Something alive. Hello, Gideon called, his voice carrying through the wind. His hand moved automatic and useless to his hip. Old habit, he wasn't carrying. He put the hand on the door instead. It was unlocked. He opened it slowly, shoulders first, instinct older than thought taking over. Anybody here, Gideon Rourke? Ruth Halsey sent me to check the cabin. The interior was dark and cold, colder than outside, almost the kind of still cold that meant no heat source had run in hours. He smelled it before he saw anything. Something expensive. Perfume delicate and out of place, hanging in the frozen air like a detail from a different world. Scout pushed past him and stopped. Gideon moved into the main room and found her. She was in the far corner, barely visible in the dark, sitting in a lightweight wheelchair. One of the wheels was bent at an angle that made his stomach tighten. The spokes splayed outward from some kind of impact. She had pulled one of the cabin's decorative blankets around herself, a thin cotton thing meant for decoration, not warmth, and she was shivering so hard the chair vibrated softly against the floor. Her hair was blonde, matted at the temples, tangled where it fell past her shoulders. Her face was pale in a way that was beyond cold drained. Her lips had gone slightly blue. Her eyes, when they found him, were shade and dark with a fear so complete it looked like the surface of something much deeper. He was aware at the edges of his attention that she was beautiful. He filed the observation and moved past it. Ma'am, he kept his voice even and low, I'm not here to hurt you. My name is Gideon. Ruth Halsey is my neighbor. She asked me to check on you. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Are you injured? She said. Her voice was barely there, a dry thread of sound. He left me. My fiancé. Prescott. We fought and he... She stopped, pulled a breath that shook. He pushed me and the chair broke. And then he just took the car. He just left. Gideon looked at the wheel. He looked at her lips, still too blue. He looked out the window where the snow was no longer drifting. It was falling in earnest now, the kind of fall that didn't pause to consider consequences. How long have you been here? Since yesterday afternoon. He did the math. 18 hours, maybe more, in a cabin with no heat and no working mobility equipment, in temperatures that had been dropping steadily for 2 days. He crouched in front of her, getting his eyes level with hers. Here's what's happening, he said. We're not staying in this cabin. My place is 2 miles back. It's warm, it's stocked, and it'll hold through whatever this storm has in mind. I'm going to carry you to my truck. Do you understand? She stared at him. The fear in her eyes didn't leave, but something else moved through it, something he couldn't immediately name. I can't, she said. My legs. I see that. I'm going to lift you. I need you to let me. She didn't answer. He didn't wait. He slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, and she was lighter than he expected. Lighter than someone who looked as solid as she did had any right to be. She let out a small sound when he lifted her. Not pain, something else. Surprise, maybe. Like being carried was a thing she hadn't considered as a possibility. Scout, he said. Heel. The dog fell into position at his left side, ears flat against the wind, eyes forward. They went out into the storm. The 2 miles were a fight that Gideon didn't describe to himself in those terms until later. In the moment, there was only the next step and the one after it. The wind came in walls, not gusts, sustained and heavy, and he turned his body sideways against the worst of it to keep it off her face. He felt her tuck her head against his chest after the first 100 yards, instinct rather than choice, and he adjusted his grip and kept moving. Scout stayed pressed against his left leg the entire way, his shoulder bumping Gideon's calf at every stride, steady as a heartbeat. When he finally kicked open the cabin door and carried her inside, the change in sound was like a door closing on a different world. The storm became muffled, a deep pressure rather than a presence. The warmth hit them both at once. He heard her exhale. He carried her to the sofa and set her down, not gently for its own sake, but with a precision that translated as gentle. He stepped back. I'm going to get the fire up, he said. Then coffee. Don't move. He was aware that the instruction was absurd given her condition, and he didn't take it back. He crossed to the fireplace and worked the fire up from embers, 3 logs placed carefully, the bellows applied with practice. Heat began to move across the room within minutes. He went to the kitchen, started coffee, and came back with a heavy ceramic mug and one of the thick wool blankets from the closet. He set the mug in her hands and folded his own over hers until she had a grip on it. Hold it, feel the heat first, then drink. She obeyed. The shivering was still working through her in waves, but it was already changing pitch, becoming something the body does to solve a problem rather than something the body does because it's lost. Gideon straightened and stood back. He watched her. He noticed things the way he always did, quickly and without announcing them. The wheelchair she'd been sitting in was a high-end model carbon fiber frame, the kind that cost as much as a used car. Her coat, still damp, had the weight and cut of something that cost more than that. Her boots, laced now with ice and mud, had been made by someone who understood what the word handmade actually meant. She was not a woman of modest means. She was not a woman who belonged in an unheated cabin in a Wyoming blizzard. He moved through the cabin, checking window, seals shuttering the north-facing panels that took the worst of the wind. The lights flickered, held, then went out. The generator would kick on in a few seconds. It did. A low hum from the shed, and the lights came back dimmer, running off reserve. Scout had taken his position on the circular rug near the hearth. He was lying down, paws crossed, but his head was up. His eyes were fixed on the woman on the sofa. Not hostile, not curious in the way a dog is curious about a new smell. Something more considered than that, more patient. Gideon sat in the wooden rocking chair near the window and opened the book he'd left face down on the side table 3 days ago. He did not speak. The woman watched him for a while. Then she watched the fire. Then she watched the dog. After a long time, she said quietly, "Thank you." He turned a page. "You're welcome." Her name, she told him the next morning, was Sloan. He said, "I know. Ruth mentioned it," and that was the end of that. The first full day of the storm was a study in what happens when 2 people who are accustomed to being alone occupy the same small space without negotiating what that means. Gideon moved through his routine as though she weren't there, not rudely, simply on the established tracks of a life that didn't have a parallel lane. He made oatmeal in the morning and placed a bowl near her on the table without ceremony. He shoveled snow from the porch and the path to the woodshed before 8 in the morning, returning with an armload of split oak that he stacked near the fireplace with practiced efficiency. He did not ask her questions. He did not make conversation. Scout watched her, not with hostility, not with the loose enthusiasm of a sociable dog. He watched her the way a careful person watches something that hasn't revealed itself yet. When she spoke to him, he tilted his head exactly once and then returned to observation. When she held out a piece of bread from her breakfast, trying to cross some distance with a gesture she understood, Gideon said from across the room without looking up, He doesn't eat from strangers. She put the bread back. She spent the first day studying the cabin the way she studied everything, with the assessing eye of someone who had spent years evaluating what things were worth and what they said about the people who owned them. What she found confused her in a way that took her a while to name. There was no clutter here, but there was no emptiness either. The shelves were built from reclaimed wood and held books with broken spines used until the covers went soft. Diesel mechanics, regional geology, the collected letters of Ulysses S. Grant, 2 volumes of Marcus Aurelius, once so read, the pages had gone translucent at the corners. The tools were hung on the wall in order of size, clean and cared for. The kitchen had no appliances that weren't used. The floor was wood-scarred by years and boots and dog claws, but scrubbed clean. This was not a house that had been decorated. It was a house that had been lived in genuinely and without performance. There was only one object on the mantelpiece, a photograph in a plain wooden frame. A woman mid-30s standing on a rock outcropping above a valley, her arms out to either side as if she were testing the air for something. She was laughing. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a rough braid. She looked like someone who was entirely comfortable standing on the edge of things. That would be Nora. Sloan looked at the photograph for a long time when Gideon was outside. The story she had told him was not a complete lie. That was perhaps the worst part. Prescott had pushed her. They had fought in the Aspen cabin, a conversation that had started about the trip and become within 20 minutes about everything else that had been accumulating between them for 2 years. He had put his hands on her arms, not gently, and moved her aside, and the wheelchair had caught on the door threshold and the wheel had buckled. He hadn't done it deliberately. He also hadn't apologized. He had stood over her, looked at the chair, looked at her and said, "I don't have time for this," and walked out. She had sat on the floor for 20 minutes before pulling herself into the damaged chair. The part she hadn't told Gideon was that she wasn't paralyzed. She was not in the wheelchair because her legs didn't work. She was in the wheelchair because 6 weeks ago, at the end of a very long and very silent calculation, she had made a choice. She had started using the chair in public first, just twice, watching the way the world rearranged itself around her, the way people saw her differently, the way Prescott reacted. Or rather, the way he didn't react. He had looked at her sitting in the chair at a charity gala with an expression that was not concern and not love and not even discomfort. It was annoyance quickly managed, the kind of expression a man makes when a piece of his presentation has developed an unexpected problem. She had understood something important in that moment. She had continued the deception. She wasn't proud of it. She had done it because she needed to know the truth of something, and she hadn't been able to find another way to test it. What happens when I am not what I am supposed to be? What happens when I remove the thing that makes me useful? The answer so far had been Prescott leaving her in a broken chair in a frozen cabin in a Wyoming blizzard. She had not called for help. She had sat in the cold and asked herself what that meant, and she had been sitting with the question for 18 hours when Scout had barked at the door. She thought about Prescott on that first night, lying on the sofa in the amber light of the oil lamps, listening to the storm work against the cabin walls. She didn't think about the Prescott who had left her. She thought about the Prescott who had existed 3 years ago before the second acquisition, and the Forbes profile and the new circle of advisors who surrounded him now like a second skin. He had been different then, or she had believed he was different. She still wasn't entirely sure which. They had met at a conference in Portland, of all places, both of them standing at the edge of a conversation they didn't want to be, in both of them reaching for the same glass of water from a passing tray at the same moment. He had laughed low and genuine and handed her the glass. They had left the conference together and walked for 2 hours through the rain without caring about it. He had seen her, not the Weston name, not the portfolio, not the assembled armor of her public self. He had seen the part of her that was tired and uncertain and looking for something real to hold on to. He had seemed then to be exactly that. She could trace the change in him now with the clarity of distance, the way a geologist could read the layers in a cliff face and name the forces that had shaped each one. Success had not made Prescott cruel. It had made him strategic in a way that eventually consumed the person underneath the strategy. He had learned to see everything as a resource, including her. He hadn't decided to stop loving her. He had simply stopped being capable of it. She didn't know when she had understood this. She knew she had spent a long time refusing to understand it. The wheelchair had been the last test. Not of him exactly, of herself. She needed to know if she could see clearly now or if she was still willing to be comfortable in a beautiful lie. She had her answer. She stared at the ceiling of the cabin and listened to the storm and thought that she had come a very long way to confirm something she had known for months. Scout moved on the second night. Gideon had been in the back room, the sound of a whetstone working against a blade coming through the closed door in a steady grating rhythm. The fire had burned down to a low orange pulse. The oil lamp on the side table cast everything in amber and shadow. Sloane had stopped trying to read an hour ago. She was sitting with the wool blanket pulled to her chin, looking at nothing, her hands still in her lap. The storm outside had settled into a sustained howl rather than the battering fury of the first day. It was in its way almost peaceful. She was thinking about nothing and everything simultaneously, the particular state of exhaustion that comes not from activity, but from the sustained effort of maintaining a version of yourself that isn't true. The shivering had stopped. The physical cold had receded, but she was still cold in some other way, a coldness that had been there long before the storm and the broken chair and the frozen cabin. A hot tear escaped down her cheek before she knew it was coming. She pressed her lips together. She turned her face toward the window so that if Gideon emerged, she would have a second to compose herself. She didn't make a sound. She was practiced at silent collapse, at letting things break inward where they couldn't be seen. The second tear followed the first, then a third. She pressed her fist against her mouth and breathed through her nose and looked at the black glass of the window and let it happen quietly with the discipline of someone who had cried alone so many times it had become its own kind of skill. She heard it before she felt it. A soft click of nails on the floorboards. She turned. Scout had left his rug. He was standing a few feet from the sofa, head tilted at a slight angle, his gray eyes fixed on her face. He wasn't moving toward her yet. He was doing something else, something that took her a moment to recognize. He was deciding. She held very still. He took one step, then another. He moved without the hesitation of approach or the casualness of a dog following an impulse. He moved with the deliberateness of a creature that had considered the situation and reached a conclusion. He stopped beside the sofa level with her face, and he lowered his head slightly and pushed his cold nose under her hand where it was clutching the blanket. She flinched. A small sound escaped her. He pushed again, not rough, insistent. And then with a long exhale that seemed to release something from both of them, he rested his broad, heavy head directly on her lap, his eyes closing. She sat frozen for a moment. Then slowly, with the carefulness of someone who understood they were being trusted with something that wasn't given easily, she lifted her hand and placed it on his head. Her fingers found the thick silver fur. He was warm in a way that radiated not just surface warmth, but the deep stored warmth of something living. He leaned into her hand almost imperceptibly and sighed again. She had not been touched with gentleness in a very long time. She realized it sitting there with her hand in Scout's fur, the fire burning low, the storm howling outside. Not held, not comforted, not touched without an agenda underneath it. She was not a transaction to this dog. She was not a liability or a symbol or a reflection of someone else's ambitions. She was simply a person in pain, and he had decided that mattered. Her throat tightened. In the back room behind the closed door, the sound of the whetstone had stopped. Gideon stood in the doorway to the main room, one hand on the frame, his gray eyes finding a Scout first and then Sloane. He was very still. He was looking at his dog. The dog who had not offered his trust to a single person in 2.5 years. The dog who had sat at a careful distance from every human being except Gideon himself. The dog who was the last living thing that remembered Nora as she was. He was watching that dog rest his head in the lap of a woman he had met 48 hours ago, with the settled certainty of an animal that had made a permanent decision. Gideon's face did not change in any dramatic way, but something around his jaw softened. A very small, very reluctant loosening, like ice at the edges of things when the sun is still low, but has started to do its work. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He stood in the doorway and watched his dog choose something, and he understood with a clarity that was uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure that Scout had never been wrong about anything important. That was when the first crack appeared. Not in the storm. Not in the silence between him and the woman on his sofa. In the wall he had built with 4 years of careful work, the wall that kept the world on the other side, and his grief on this one, and the two of them separate where they belonged. The crack was small, a hairline fracture in stone that has been under pressure for too long. But it was there. Outside, the storm pushed against the cabin walls and found no give. Inside, Scout breathed slowly in Sloane's lap, his eyes closed, his silver sides rising and falling. And Gideon Rourke stood in a doorway and let himself be uncertain for the first time in years. The morning after Scout made his decision, the cabin felt different in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. The storm had not eased. If anything, it had gathered itself overnight into something more purposeful, the wind no longer howling in irregular bursts, but sustaining a single long note like a bow drawn slowly across a string. The drifts against the north windows had climbed past the lower sills. The world outside had been reduced to white. Inside, Gideon moved through his morning routine with the same economy of motion as always. Fire fed, coffee started, boots laced, but the rigid set of his shoulders had changed by some small, almost undetectable degree, the way a rope changes when the tension on one end is slightly released. He didn't look at Sloane differently. He didn't speak to her more. But he no longer moved through the cabin as though she were furniture to be navigated around. Scout had slept on the floor beside the sofa. He was there when Sloane opened her eyes, his head already up tail moving once when she stirred. She looked at him for a long moment before she looked at anything else. Gideon set a mug of coffee on the table near her without a word. He stood and looked at Scout, then at Sloane, then back at the dog. He said nothing. He went back to the kitchen. The morning passed in its particular silence. Sloane sat with the coffee and let herself be still, which was not something she was practiced at. Her life for the past several years had been constructed around motion, the forward momentum of deals and appearances, and the management of Prescott's expectations and her own image. Stillness in that life was where doubt lived, and she had learned to outpace it. Here there was nowhere to go. She watched Gideon. He was meticulous without being precious about it, the way men are when they've learned that attention to small things is what keeps larger things from failing. He checked the window seals. He inventoried the woodpile and restacked it for efficiency. He sharpened a kitchen knife that was already sharp, running it across the stone with a steady meditative stroke. She tried to read. The words didn't hold. She looked instead at the photograph on the mantel. Nora, arms spread, laughing at something the camera couldn't see. A woman who had stood on the edge of things without fear. Sloane thought about what Gideon had said on the porch the previous afternoon, the brief, halting way he'd spoken, how each sentence had seemed to cost him something. He had said Nora's name the way you say a word in a language you're not sure you still remember carefully, with the awareness that the saying of it changes something. She had listened without moving, without filling the pauses the way she would have in any other conversation, with reassurance or redirection, or the smooth professional instinct to keep things comfortable. She had just let him speak and let the words be what they were. She understood with a clarity that sat uncomfortably in her chest that she had been trusted with something he didn't give to people, and she had been sitting in a broken wheelchair she didn't need. The weight of that had settled in her overnight and taken up permanent residence somewhere behind her sternum. It didn't feel like guilt exactly, though. Guilt was part of it. It felt like the specific shame of having brought something false into a place built entirely on truth, like carrying a counterfeit into a room where everything else is real and watching the difference become undeniable. Scout put his head on her knee at some point in the late morning, unprompted, and she rested her hand on his neck and looked at the fire and sat with what she'd done. On the afternoon of the third day, Gideon built the ramp. He had come in from outside, snow-caked and smelling of cold air and sawdust, and stood in the middle of the main room, looking at the 3 shallow steps that separated Sloane's level from the front door. He stood there for a moment with his coffee, not speaking, not explaining, just looking at the problem, the way a man looks at something he has decided to solve. Then he set the mug down and went to the storage closet for a measuring tape. He measured the steps. He measured the width of the doorway. He wrote numbers on a scrap of pine with a carpenter's pencil. He put his coat back on and went outside, and Sloane heard the creak of the workshop door, followed by the sound of a handsaw working through lumber with slow, even strokes. She sat on the sofa and listened to him build. It took nearly 2 hours. The sawing, the drill, this careful, muffled sound of a hammer's working close so the noise wouldn't carry too hard through the walls. She found herself following the sounds with her eyes even though there was nothing to see, the way you track a conversation in another room, even when you can't make out the words. He came back with a ramp of raw plywood and 2x4s, plain and slightly rough at the edges, built for function and not for anything else. He maneuvered it through the door and set it in place over the steps. It fit cleanly. He stood back and ran his boot along one edge, testing the stability, and it didn't move. "It'll hold," he said. "It's not finished work." "It's perfect," Sloane said. Her voice came out thicker than she intended. He looked at her for a moment, something moving through his expression that he didn't give words to, and then he walked past her to the broken wheelchair in the corner. He examined the bent wheel, turned it in his hands, and then, with a grunt of effort, bent the metal frame back toward True. Not perfect, but functional. The wheel wobbled, but it rolled. He set the chair in front of her. "Let's get some air." The transfer from the sofa to the chair was clumsy, in the way those things always are, and Gideon's hands were matter-of-fact about it, holding her steady, without ceremony, without the particular careful tenderness that would have made it worse somehow. He pushed the chair up the ramp and through the door. The cold hit her like a second awakening. She had been inside for 3 days. The air outside was so sharp and clean, it almost had a taste, pine and ice, and something deeper beneath both the smell of altitude and open space. The sky was a heavy pale gray, the mountains barely visible through the low cloud. The snow was enormous, sculpted into shapes by the wind, deep and brilliant and untouched. She looked at it and felt something shift inside her that she couldn't immediately name. Gideon stood at the porch railing, not touching her, not speaking, just sharing the cold. Scout sat beside him, breath pluming, watching the trees. "Nobody did that for me before," Sloane said. Her voice was quiet. She wasn't performing the statement. She was simply reporting it. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "It's just wood," he said. "It's a practical problem with a practical answer." She shook her head slowly. "It's more than that." He looked uncomfortable with the observation, in the way of a man who has done something genuinely good and finds the acknowledgement of it harder than the doing. He looked back at the mountains. They stood in the cold for a long time. She asked him eventually why he stayed out here alone. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "It's not alone, not exactly." He nodded down at Scout. "And this is her place," he said, meaning the mountain, meaning Nora. "We built this together. Every board, every window." She argued with the contractor about the roof pitch for 2 weeks, and she was right. He paused. "When she was gone, I thought about leaving. But leaving felt like losing her twice." He touched the support post with one hand briefly, the way you touch something to confirm it's still there. "So I stayed," he said, "and I kept building things." Sloane looked at the ramp he had just built for her, the raw plywood, the careful joints, the hours of coal work in the workshop. She understood him then in a way that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with recognition. She understood what it meant to build things to keep the people you'd lost from disappearing entirely. She also understood, with a quiet and devastating clarity, that she didn't deserve to be on the receiving end of that kind of work. The third night was the longest. Gideon was on his cot near the door, his back to the room, and Sloane knew from the quality of his stillness that he wasn't sleeping. She wasn't sleeping either. The storm had returned for a final surge, the worst wind yet, a sustained assault that made the cabin walls tremble and the fire gutter sideways in the hearth. She lay on the sofa and looked at the ceiling and made herself face what she had been circling for 3 days. The wheelchair had been a tool. She had told herself it was a test, but tests have integrity when both parties know they're being tested. This had been a deception, and the person it had deceived most thoroughly was herself. She had believed when she started it that she was being clever, that she was extracting herself from Prescott on her own terms, gathering evidence of who he truly was before she made the decision she already knew she needed to make. What she had not accounted for was Gideon. She had not accounted for a man who would drive 2 miles through a blizzard for a neighbor stranger, who would build a ramp from raw lumber without being asked, who would stand on a porch in the cold and say his dead wife's name for the first time in years to a woman he had no reason to trust. She had not accounted for Scout. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and breathed carefully. She was not crying for what she had lost. She was crying for what she had brought into this house. The lie felt different here than it had felt anywhere else. It felt like a violation of something that had nothing to do with her, like putting a lock on a door that had been built to stay open. After a while, when the storm had eased fractionally and the fire had settled to a deep red pulse, she simply needed to stand, not to go anywhere, not to test anything, just to feel the blood moving through her legs, to have the physical reminder that she was a person with a body that worked, a fact she had been obscuring from herself along with everything else. She waited until she was certain Gideon was asleep. She moved the blankets aside and placed her feet on the floor. She stood. The floor was cold through her socks. She stood beside the window and looked out at the storm, one hand braced lightly on the frame, and let herself be vertical for the first time in 3 days. She reached up and worked a knot out of her shoulder, rolling it slowly, her arm extended above her head. It was for a moment the most honest thing she had done in months. The light hit her from behind. She didn't understand what she was seeing in the glass at first. Then she understood. The window was reflecting the room behind her, and the room behind her had a light in it, a flashlight beam, steady and unwavering, pointed directly at her back. She went very still. The silence in the cabin was absolute. She turned slowly. Gideon was standing near his cot, the flashlight in his outstretched hand, its beam landing on her with the precision of an accusation. He was not moving. He was not speaking. His face in the backscatter of the light was a landscape she had never seen before. Not angry, not betrayed in the way of someone surprised. Something worse. The face of a man who has been careful his entire life and has just watched the thing he was careful about fail. Gideon, she said. His name came out as barely more than breath. He didn't answer. The silence pressed down on both of them like a physical weight, the sound of everything that had been built in 3 days coming apart at a single point. And then a third sound entered the room, a soft noise, confused and sleepy, from the floor beside the sofa. Scout had lifted his head. He blinked in the light. He stood stretched, the long, familiar stretch of a dog waking from deep sleep, and looked between them. His dog's mind processed the scene with the directness that had no room for subtext. There was Gideon. There was Sloan. Sloan was standing up the same way Gideon stood up. This was new. This was good. This was perhaps the beginning of something he had been hoping for. His tail began to move. Sloan shook her head at him, a small, desperate motion. Scout tilted his head, confused. Her distress was real, he could smell it, but she was also standing, and standing was clearly a positive development, and he didn't have the language for the contradiction. He let out a single bright bark, short, sharp, purely joyful. The sound of a toy who has just seen something go right. The bark detonated in the silence like something dropped from a great height. Gideon's jaw moved. He lowered the flashlight until the beam fell on the floor. And then, with a click that was the quietest and most final sound Sloan had ever heard, he turned it off. The room went dark, lit only by the dying embers, and neither of them moved for a long time. The morning came without ceremony. Gideon was up before the light, as always, moving through the cold cabin with the efficiency of a man who has decided not to feel anything he hasn't given permission to feel. He fed the fire. He made coffee, one mug. He fed Scout, who ate without his usual patience, watching the room with the anxious attention of a creature that knows something is wrong and can not locate the source. Sloan sat on the edge of the sofa. Her feet were on the floor. The broken wheelchair sat in the corner, and neither of them looked at it. She said his name. He said, "Don't." The word was flat and empty. Not the flatness of suppressed rage, the flatness of a door that has been closed and locked, and the key put somewhere it won't be found. It was, she understood, the worst version of the word she could have heard. She would have preferred the anger. He pulled on his boots and his jacket and took the shovel from beside the door and went outside. She watched through the window as he cleared the path to the woodshed with the focused energy of a man taking something out on the snow. He worked steadily, mechanically, his breath coming in sharp white bursts. He reached the porch and found the ramp he had spent 2 hours building in a cold workshop the day before. He looked at it for a moment, then he kicked it loose from the steps, picked it up, carried it to the edge of the cleared area, and threw it into the nearest snowdrift. Sloan closed her eyes. Scout inside made a low sound and went to the door. The sound of the helicopter came an hour later. Not the natural sounds of the mountain. Something mechanical and deliberate, the deep, rhythmic thudding of rotors cutting through the cold air, growing from a distant pulse to a physical presence that vibrated in the window glass. Scout erupted at the door. Not the frantic alarm of the Aspen cabin, something harder and more controlled, a series of deep warning barks directed upward. Gideon outside stopped shoveling and stood with his head up, scanning the sky. Sloane was already at the window. She had known what it was before she could fully hear it. She had felt it, the particular dread of something you've been dreading finally arriving. A black helicopter broke through the low cloud and circled once before descending into the flat clearing beside the cabin, its rotor wash blasting the surface snow into a horizontal white blur. It settled. The blade slowed. The side door opened. A man in a dark flight suit stepped out first and stood at attention beside the aircraft. And then the second man stepped out. Prescott Vane crossed the snow toward the cabin as though crossing the lobby of a building he owned. His cashmere overcoat was the precise color of authority. His shoes were an absurdity in this landscape, polished black leather that would be ruined within 20 steps. He didn't look down at them. He looked at the cabin with the assessing expression of a man cataloging an asset. He looked at Gideon with no expression at all. Then he saw Sloane on the porch where she had moved without consciously deciding to, and something crossed his face that she recognized. Satisfaction. Not relief, not concern. The satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. Sloane, he said, his voice carried easily in the cold, calm air. Well, you're standing. She said nothing. He tilted his head slightly, performing mild amusement. Did you really believe the phone I gave you was only for emergencies? The GPS chip was installed the first week. My security team has known your location since the moment you left. He paused to let that settle. I wanted to see how long the performance would last. He looked at Gideon, and whether you'd find yourself a supporting cast. Gideon was standing 15 feet from the porch, the shovel still in his hand, his face showing nothing. He was looking at Prescott, the way he looked at weather, assessing the nature of the threat without giving anything away. Prescott turned back to Sloane. The performance is over, he said, his voice losing its lightness, now becoming the voice he used in boardrooms. The Anderson Gala is Friday. We have commitments. You've made your point, whatever it was, and now it's time to go. Cole will have us back in 3 hours. He took a step toward the porch. Scout moved. He came off the porch steps without a sound, planting himself in the snow between Prescott and the steps, and the sound that came out of him was not the bark he had aimed at the helicopter. It was lower and more deliberate, a sound that started in his chest and carried the weight of an intention. Prescott stopped. His polished facade cracked at the edges, a flicker of something real and unmanaged moving through his eyes. He took one step back. Call off your dumb, he said, looking at Gideon. Gideon didn't move. Prescott looked back at Sloane, his jaw tight now. The performance dropped entirely. Emma, he said, and the name was wrong. The name he used when he was reminding her of something, when he was positioning her back in the frame where she belonged. I am not standing in a field in Wyoming arguing about this. Get your things. He reached for her arm. Scout snapped the air, a single sharp crack of sound that stopped Prescott's hand mid-extension as effectively as a physical barrier. Sloane looked at the dog. Scout 3 inches of snow on his paws, the cold silvering the tips of his fur, holding his ground with the absolute certainty of an animal that has chosen a side and will not be argued out of it. She thought about what he was. A dog who had not trusted anyone in 2.5 years. A dog who had no knowledge of her bank balance, or her family name, or her public image, or her private failures. A dog who had sat across a room and watched her for 2 days and then walked across the floor in the dark and put his head in her lap because he had decided on whatever terms dogs decide things that her pain was real and that it mattered. She had not earned that. She knew she hadn't earned it, but it had been given anyway, and she was not going to board a helicopter and leave it behind. No, she said. Prescott went very still. The words seemed to confuse him the way a locked door confuses someone who has never encountered a locked door. What? She said it again, clearly with the voice she used when she was not performing anything. No, I'm not going. The silence that followed was enormous. Prescott looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Gideon, who was still holding the shovel, with no particular expression. He looked at Scout, who had not moved. He made the calculation that men like him make when the variables have shifted and the math no longer works in their favor. He straightened his coat. "This conversation isn't over," he said. His voice had returned to its managed register, smooth and final. He turned and walked back to the helicopter. The flight-suited man opened the door. Prescott stepped inside without looking back. The door closed. The rotors began to turn. Scout stayed where he was until the helicopter had cleared the tree line. Then he turned and walked back to the porch and sat beside Sloane, pressing his shoulder against her leg. He looked up at her once. She put her hand on his head. She was aware of Gideon standing somewhere behind her. She didn't turn around. There were too many things in the air at once, the receding sound of the rotors, the cold settling back into the vacancy. The helicopter had left the specific emotional weight of the decision she had just made, which was not dramatic so much as irrevocable. After a while, she heard Gideon go back inside. She heard the door close. She stood on the porch with her hand on Scout's head and looked at the mountains until the cold in her feet became impossible to ignore. She waited until she was certain Gideon had gone to the woodshed the next morning. She had listened to his routine for 4 days now, and she knew its sounds as well as she knew her own heartbeat. The door, the path, the creak of the woodshed hinge. She worked quickly, not because she was afraid of being caught. She was past the point where that fear meant anything. She moved quickly because every minute that passed in this cabin was another minute of taking something she had no right to. She found a piece of notepaper on the kitchen table, a torn page from a supply list blank on one side. She found a pen that was almost dry and pressed hard to keep the ink moving. She did not write an apology. Apologies were for people who had made mistakes. She had made a choice fully and with clear eyes, and calling it a mistake would be its own kind of dishonesty. She wrote instead the truth. All of it. The wheelchair, the plan, what she had been running from, and what she had been trying to find. She wrote about Prescott, the early version, and the one he had become, and the space between them that she had tried to paper over with her own willingness to be what he needed. She wrote about arriving in this cabin and understanding within 24 hours that she was the only fake thing in it. She wrote about Scout. She wrote about the moment he crossed the room and put his head in her lap and what that had meant to her, what it still meant. She wrote that she understood she had no claim on his trust. She wrote that she was sorrier for that than for any other single thing about the past 4 days. She folded the letter, she placed it on the table and weighed it down with a smooth river stone from the windowsill. She pulled out the satellite phone, not to call Prescott, not to call anyone Prescott knew. She scrolled to a number she had memorized 10 years ago and never deleted. Simon Birch. He had been her father's driver and then hers, and he was the most discreet human being she had ever met. She texted him her GPS coordinates in 4 words. Come when road clears. Then she sent a second message. For Scout. She had remembered Gideon's worn supply catalog, remembered flipping through it absently on the second day, remembered a page of dog toys and Scout's eyes landing on a large red rubber ball with the brief, intense focus of an animal who doesn't allow himself to want things. She asked Simon to bring it with him when he came. She set the phone on the table beside the letter. She looked at Scout, who was watching her from his rug with his head up and his ears slightly forward. I'm sorry, she said. The words were small and inadequate, and she said them anyway because they were true. He made a low sound in his throat. Not a whine, something quieter than that. An acknowledgement. She heard Gideon's boots on the porch steps. She sat back down on the sofa and put her hands in her lap and waited for whatever came next. She was gone when he came back inside. Gideon stood in the doorway and took in the cabin the way he had been trained to take in rooms quickly, completely cataloging what was present and what was absent. The sofa empty, the broken wheelchair gone, the wool blankets folded at one end with a precision that looked deliberate, like a small apology in textile form. Scout was sitting in the middle of the room, not on his rug, not by the door. In the middle, equidistant from everything, as if he hadn't been able to decide where to position himself in relation to an absence. Gideon looked at the kitchen table. The letter was there, weighted by the riverstone. Beside it, a satellite phone he hadn't seen before, the expensive kind, its screen dark. He looked at the letter for a long time without touching it. Then he picked it up, unfolded it, and read it standing at the table with his coat still on and his boots still wet from the snow. He read it once. He read it again. He set it down and stood with his hands flat on the table and looked at the wall above the stove where Nora had hung a small iron hook for the cast iron skillet, and the hook was still there, and the skillet was still on it, and everything in the room was exactly where it had always been. He picked the letter up a third time and read the part about Scout, the part about the moment in the dark, the cold nose under her hand, the head in her lap. He read the line about being the only false thing in the cabin, and he set the letter down again and pressed his knuckles against the table until the pressure became something he could organize himself around. He went to the small metal box on the shelf above his desk. He had not opened it in 3 years. It held Nora's letters, the ones she had written to him during his last deployment, the ones she had pressed into his hand at the airport. He opened it, now placed Sloane's letter inside without reading it a fourth time, and closed the lid. Scout came and sat at his feet and looked up at him. Gideon looked back. There was nothing to say, and they both understood that. The red ball appeared 2 days later. Simon Birch, who Gideon never saw, had apparently left it on the porch at some point during the first night after the road cleared, along with the satellite phone that had been on the table and a brief unsigned note that said only her instructions. She wanted him to have it. Gideon found it on the porch mat in the morning, bright red, large, the kind of rubber so dense it rang like a bell when you rapped it with a knuckle. It was tied with a simple piece of twine, no bow, no card other than the note. He looked at it for a full minute. He picked it up and carried it inside and set it on the hearthrug and said nothing about it. Scout was across the room when it happened. He had been watching Gideon come through the door the way he always did, tracking the mood before the movement. But when the red ball hit the hearthrug and rolled a half turn and stopped, Scout went still in a different way. His nose lifted, his ears moved forward to their sharpest angle. He stared at the ball with an attention so complete and so unguarded that Gideon had to look away. The dog hadn't looked like that since Nora. Scout crossed the room in slow, careful steps, the way he moved toward things he wanted to be sure about. He lowered his nose to the ball and breathed it in for a long moment. Then he nudged it with his nose. It rolled 6 inches and stopped. He nudged it again. Something in his chest, some gathered tightness that had been there for 2.5 years, released. He pounced. Gideon stood in the kitchen doorway and watched his dog, his stoic and serious and grief-worn dog, bat a red rubber ball across the floor with both paws and chase it into the base of the sofa and then back out again, with his tail going like a weather vane in a high wind. He felt the anger rise, and he let it rise, and then he watched it pass through him like weather. He went to his book and sat down and didn't say anything. That night, Scout picked up a ball and carried it to Gideon's chair and dropped it on his boot. He looked up. Gideon looked down. He picked the ball up and threw it underhand across the room, without standing, without thinking about it, without deciding to. Scout retrieved it and brought it back. They did that 4 times before Gideon caught himself and stopped. But he had thrown it. That was the thing he didn't examine until later. 3 weeks passed. The world outside the cabin reassembled itself with the slow, grudging efficiency of Wyoming in November turning toward December. The plow came through the main road. Power was restored to the line that served the properties up the ridge. The temperature stayed hard and the snow stayed deep, but the violence had gone out of the weather, replaced by a cold that was clear and still and almost generous in its honesty. Gideon ran his routine. Woodpile, tools, perimeter. He drove into Pinedale once a week for supplies and spoke to no one more than necessary, which was how it had always been. Ruth Halsey left a pie on the porch on a Tuesday and did not call. He ate half of it over 2 days and left the tin on the post at the end of the drive. He did not read Sloane's letter again. He did not take it out of the box. He thought about it the way you think about something you have put away properly. It was there. He knew where it was. He had chosen not to look at it. Scout was different. Not in his habits, not in his watchfulness, not in the fundamental character of the animal who had been his partner for 2.5 years. But somewhere inside that character, something had shifted back toward life. He played with the red ball every morning. He slept longer and more deeply. He had begun to make sounds Gideon hadn't heard from him before, small huffs of impatience. When his breakfast was 5 minutes late, a low, satisfied groan when he stretched out by the fire in the evening. Dog sounds, the sounds of an animal that has decided to be in the world rather than beside it. Gideon watched this and understood it, and found it difficult in ways he didn't try to organize into words. One evening, sitting in his chair while Scout lay by the hearth with the red ball clamped between his paws, Gideon took out the supply catalog that had been on the side table since before the storm. He flipped through it without purpose. He reached the page of dog toys. He could see on the page the red ball. He could see the dent where Scout's nose had worn the catalog's spine soft at exactly that page. He closed the catalog and sat with it in his lap and looked at the fire for a long time. The letter from the bank came on a Friday. He almost didn't open it. The mortgage correspondence had a particular look to it now, a visual language of threat that he had learned to recognize from the weight of the envelope alone. He stood at the kitchen table with it in his hand and felt the familiar low dread of a man looking at a number that doesn't add up and hasn't added up for longer than he'd admitted. He opened it. He read the first paragraph. Then he stopped. He read it again more slowly with the attention of a man who has learned that official documents sometimes say things that don't match what you expected them to say, and that you should confirm the mismatch before reacting to it. The outstanding balance on the mortgage held against the property at 14 Delta Road, Sublet, County, Wyoming, had been paid in full. Settled. A zero balance statement was attached. The property was clear. He looked at the payment details. Payer of record, Weston Family Trust. And then in a separate enclosure, a single page from a land conservation attorney in Cheyenne. It informed him that a conservation easement had been established on the property in the surrounding 40 acres, permanently restricting commercial development, subdivision, and resource extraction. The easement was held in perpetuity by a newly established entity. Its name was the Nora Rourke Conservation Trust. Gideon sat down. He sat at the kitchen table where Sloane's letter had been, where the river stone had held it down, and he put the papers flat on the wood surface and pressed his palms over them and breathed. His first feeling was what he had expected to feel, the hot, clarifying surge of pride refusing to be purchased, the impulse to pick up the phone and find a way to send every dollar back and say what he thought of the gesture. He knew that impulse. He had lived inside it his entire adult life. You do not take what you have not earned. You do not let someone else carry your weight. These were not opinions. They were structural. They were load-bearing. They were the thing the rest of him was built on top of. He sat with the impulse and let it run. Then he went to the file cabinet in the corner and pulled out the folder he had been avoiding for 6 months. He put everything on the table. The past due notices, the interest statements, the letter from the bank's legal department with its careful language about timelines and remedies, the original loan document from 2019, the year he and Nora had refinanced to cover the cost of her treatment. He had never laid it all out like this. He had been managing it in pieces the way you manage something you're not ready to fully see. He looked at it fully now. The number was what it had always been, what he had always known it was, but had refused to confront in its entirety. There was no version of this math that worked. He had known that for a year and a half and had kept paying minimum amounts and not thinking about the ceiling that was slowly descending. He was not losing this property. He had already lost it. He had simply not finished losing it yet. He looked at the Conservation Trust document. Nora Rourke Conservation Trust. Sloane had not put her own name on it. She had not put her family name. She had not attached herself to the gesture in any way that could be read as ownership or claim. She had taken the one name that meant everything to this land and made it permanent. He thought about what she had written in the letter, the part he had read twice and then closed away. She had not said she was paying his debt. She had said she was preventing a bank from owning what Nora had designed and built and loved. She had said she was protecting something that had no business being touched by people who saw land only as a line on a balance sheet. She had said that if he wanted to be angry about that, she understood, but that she had done it before she could talk herself out of it, and she would do it again. He sat for a long time. Then he got up and went to the shelf and took down the metal box and opened it and took Sloane's letter out and read it from the beginning. All of it this time without stopping. He read it once and put it back. He went to the hearth and sat in his chair. Scout came and put his head on Gideon's knee, the red ball resting on the floor beside him. Gideon put his hand on Scout's neck and felt the warmth there and looked at the fire. He did not come to a conclusion. He came to a different kind of stillness, not the stillness of resolution, but the stillness of a man who has stopped fighting the current long enough to see where it's actually moving. Ruth Halsey called the next morning. He let it ring twice and then picked up. Ruth, she was quiet for a moment, which wasn't like her. Then she said, "I owe you the truth about something." He waited. "I knew who Sloane Weston was before I called you that night. She had contacted me 3 weeks before the storm to rent the Aspen cabin. She told me she needed to disappear for a little while. Ruth paused. I've known women who needed to disappear, Gideon. Real ones. And I knew she wasn't telling me the whole story, and I made a decision. He said nothing. I called you because you're the only person on this mountain who could have given her what she needed. Not comfort, not charity. Ruth's voice was careful and direct. She needed to see herself clearly, and that doesn't happen in a spa or a city hotel or any of the places a woman with her resources would go. It happens somewhere honest. It happens with someone honest. She needed Scout, Gideon said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, she did. He leaned against the wall and looked out the west-facing window at the mountains Nora had loved. You set this up, he said. It wasn't accusatory, it was a statement of engineering. I introduced the variables, Ruth said. I didn't control the outcome. She sighed. I know what it cost you. I'm not sorry for making the call. I am sorry I didn't tell you the whole truth of it. The line was quiet for a few seconds. You knew about the mortgage too, he said. It wasn't a question. A long pause. Yes, he thought about asking how. He decided it didn't matter. She makes her own choices, he said finally. She always did. That's what I told her, Ruth said quietly. That's exactly what I told her. He hung up. He stood at the window for a while. Scout came and sat beside him, shoulder pressing against his calf, and they both looked at the mountains. He was repairing fence on a Thursday morning in late November when Scout heard it. The temperature had come up slightly, a relative warmth that meant the snow's surface had softened to something between crust and mud, depending on the light. Gideon was working the post driver with the steady rhythm of physical work that clears the mind without emptying it, the rhythm Nora had called his thinking hammer, because she could always tell when he was working something out. He was working something out. Scout was lying in a patch of weak sunlight, 20 feet away, the red ball between his front paws, making intermittent attempts to get Gideon to engage that Gideon was intermittently refusing. It was their established pattern, and they were both comfortable with it. Then Scout's head came up. Not gradually, all at once, ears at full extension, body going from loose to locked in a single instant. The red ball was forgotten. He stood. Gideon stopped and held the post driver and listened. It took him another 10 seconds to hear what Scout had already heard. A vehicle on the access road. Not his truck, which was parked outside the shed. An engine he didn't know running a little rough, working hard against the grade. Scout didn't bark. He didn't move toward the road. He stood with his ears up and his head tilted, and something about his posture was different from the helicopter. Different from any unknown arrival Gideon had seen him respond to in 2.5 years. The red ball had been between his paws. He picked it up. Gideon watched the dog pick up the ball and understood before he understood anything else what that meant. The vehicle came through the tree line and stopped at the edge of the cleared area. It was a Ford pickup older than his own. One door a slightly different shade of blue from the rest of the body rust working at the wheel wells. A rental he could tell from the bar code sticker on the windshield, but not a polished rental. Someone had gone out of their way to rent something ordinary. The engine cut, a door opened. She stepped out. He had formed some idea in the weeks since she left of what it would look like if she came back. He had not meant to form this idea. It had assembled itself without his permission, the way things do when you're trying not to think about them. In that involuntary picture, she had looked more or less as she had in the cabin, a woman whose wealth was visible even through the circumstances of its concealment. This was not that. She was wearing jeans that had been washed many times, a heavy wool sweater in plain dark green, and boots that were built for terrain and showed it. Her hair was pulled back in a simple knot at the base of her neck, no styling, just gathered and secured. Her face was clean, no armor of any kind, the cold having put color into her cheeks that made her look younger and more uncertain and more real than he had seen her look at any point in the 4 days she had spent in his cabin. She closed the truck door with a soft click and stood beside it. She did not come toward him. She put her hands in her pockets and stood at the far edge of the cleared space 20 yards away, and she waited. Gideon held the post driver and looked at her across the snow. Scout was already moving. He had covered half the distance before Gideon fully registered it, not running but moving with the swift, certain purposefulness of an animal that knows where it's going and has been waiting to go there. The red ball was in his mouth. He crossed the snowy yard, his paws punching through the softened surface, and reached her and stopped and looked up. Sloane dropped to her knees. She went down in the snow in front of him without hesitation, without concern for the wet or the cold. And Scout pressed his face against her neck and made the sound Gideon had never heard him make before, a high, sustained whine that had every register of 2.5 years of feeling compressed into it. His whole body was moving. His tail, his shoulders, his ears, the long silver line of his back, every part of him in motion, simultaneously overcome with the simple and absolute relief of something lost being found. She had her arms around him and her face pressed into his ruff, and she was crying with the directness of someone who had stopped managing their crying, and Scout was licking the tears off her face with a thoroughness that was more medical than tender, and she laughed through it, a broken, wet sound that was one of the most honest sounds Gideon had ever heard. Then Scout stepped back, collected himself with visible effort, looked down at the ball and at his mouth, and placed it in her hands. He pushed it toward her with his nose. She looked at it. She looked at him. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a saw, and pulled her arm back and threw it across the yard in a long, arcing throw, and Scout exploded after it, his paws spraying snow, his tail a blur. Gideon had not moved. He stood with the post driver and watched his dog, the dog who had been a gray and silent grief for 2.5 years, running in the snow with his whole body given over to the uncomplicated joy of a ball and the person who had thrown it. He watched Scout retrieve it and circle back and drop it at Sloane's feet and bark once sharp and bright, requesting the obvious. She threw it again. Scout was already running before it left her hand. Gideon thought about Nora. He thought about the way she had moved through this land like she understood it from the inside. He thought about what she had said once in the last months when he had sat beside her bed and tried to talk about what came after. She had put her hand on his arm and said, "You have to let Scout keep living, Gideon. He'll need that. You both will." He had understood it as something she needed to believe, a comfort she was constructing for him. He had nodded and said nothing and carried the words without knowing what to do with them. He stood in the snow and watched his dog run. He understood now. Scout came back to Sloane a third time, dropped the ball, and then turned and looked directly at Gideon across the yard. An unambiguous look, the look of an animal delivering a verdict. Sloane stood up from her knees, snow on her jeans, color in her face, her eyes red from crying, and clear in a way that they had not been in the 4 days he'd known her, as though the crying had washed something out that had been clouding them. She looked at him with the directness of someone who has stopped calculating how they're being perceived. She said, "I didn't come to ask for anything." She said it quietly, carrying it. "I know what I did in that cabin, and I know what it cost, and I'm not standing here asking you to pretend it didn't happen." He said nothing. "I came because I needed to see Scout." She glanced down at the boy who had returned to her side and was leaning his weight against her leg. "And because I needed you to see me without the lie, just once, so that it existed somewhere." She stopped. The wind moved through the pines above the cabin with a sound like something settling. "I can't take the mortgage back," she said. "That's done. Nora's name is on the trust. That's not mine to undo, and I won't. But I want you to know it wasn't about buying anything. It wasn't about clearing an account or making myself feel better about what I did." She paused. "I've spent a lot of years using money to solve problems that money can't solve. I know the difference now." She looked at the cabin behind him. The west-facing windows Nora had argued for, the roof pitch, the honest functional lines of a structure built by two people who knew what they were building and why. "I know the difference," she said again more quietly, "because I spent 4 days inside something real." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Scout, who was sitting between them now, with the red ball in his mouth and his ears forward, waiting with the patience of an animal that has made its position clear and is confident in the outcome. He looked at the post driver in his hand. He thought about all the fences he had built and maintained and repaired since Nora died, the way physical work had been the architecture of survival for 4 years, the way he had built things to keep himself from coming apart. He set the post driver down in the snow. It landed softly without drama. He looked at Sloane and at the cabin and at the mountains that Nora had loved and that were still here, intact, undiminished, carrying 4 years of his grief without complaint. He looked at the document in the cabinet inside the trust bearing Nora's name, her presence made permanent, in the land she had understood. He was tired. Not physically tired, though, that too. Tired in the place where he had been fighting the longest. The place that had no name, but that every person recognizes, the place where you have been holding something at arm's length, because letting it come closer feels like losing something you've already lost. He nodded once toward the cabin. His voice came out rough from disuse. "Come inside," he said. "You're getting cold." He turned and walked toward the porch. He didn't look back. He had said what he had to say with the words available to him, which were few, and she would understand them or she wouldn't. He heard her footsteps in the snow behind him. He heard the click and scatter of Scout's claws moving at a trot, positioning himself in the space between them with the satisfied air of an animal who has managed a difficult situation to a satisfactory conclusion. Gideon opened the cabin door and stepped inside. The warmth was immediate and familiar. The smell of wood smoke and coffee, and the particular quality of air in a space that has been lived in, honestly, for a long time. Scout came through the door next the red ball in his mouth and went directly to his rug by the hearth and lay down and put the ball between his paws and sighed with his whole body. Then Sloane came through the door. Gideon moved to the fireplace and began to build up the fire the way he always did, methodically, without rushing. He heard her close the door behind her. He heard her stand still for a moment in the silence of the cabin. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. There would be things to say later. There would be difficult conversations and honest ones, and the long, unglamorous work of two people deciding whether to trust each other with the weight they were each still carrying. That was all ahead. Right now, there was the fire and the warmth and the sound of snow beginning again. Outside, softer this time, the season settling into itself without violence. There was Scout on his rug with his red ball and his eyes finally closed. And there was the quiet. It was different from the quiet of the past 4 years, the cabin's quiet, the careful, preserved silence of a man keeping something intact. It was fuller. It had more inside it. It was the kind of quiet that exists not in the absence of people, but between them, in the space where two people have decided to stop pretending and have not yet found all the words for what comes next. Gideon Rourke had lived in this cabin for 7 years. He knew every sound it made, every way the wind moved through its corners, every creak and settle of wood that had become, over time, the vocabulary of a life. He listened to it now. The fire, the snow, the dog breathing, the sound of someone else in the room. Outside, the last of the afternoon light fell across the western ridge, and the mountains stood as they had always stood, indifferent and enormous, impermanent, holding the season in their palms. The cabin door stayed closed. The snow came down.